discussion around this new volume that you can actually read it now, but when will it actually be purchasable in paper, like in, what, 3 or 4 months? What do we think? Okay, so at least 3 months. And the title of the book is When Democracy Breaks. My name is Arkan Fung, and I'm the faculty director of the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovations. I want to start with a few announcements before diving into today's subject of When Democracy Breaks. The Ash Center acknowledges the land on which Harvard University sits as the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. We also recognize the continuing presence of the neighboring Wampanoag and Nipmuc nations. Today's talk is being recorded and made publicly available on the Ash Center's YouTube page. So we ask that all remarks, including questions from the audience, be spoken into a microphone, and keep in mind that your remarks will be recorded for posterity. We're going to spend the next hour having a conversation with the panelists, and then we'll take questions from the audience at around 5 p.m. and then wrap up around 5:30. During the Q&A, if you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll circulate the mic and go in order of whoever's holding the mic. The folks today are a subset of the people who contributed to this edited collection of historical case studies on democratic erosion called When Democracy Breaks. This is the first volume in our open access series at the Ash Center. This is the 20th anniversary of the Ash Center, depending on how you count. And we were trying to figure out how to celebrate the 20th anniversary. And our first idea was to have a big party, which is what most people, it's very expensive given that we've been around 20 years and there's probably about 700 fellows. So instead of doing that, we have decided to invest the money that we would have spent on a big party into making a series of books available, some current books, some past titles from scholars in the broader Ash family, available for open access. And that means we pay the publisher a little bit, or not a little bit, a chunk of money, and then anyone can for free. In candor, we didn't pay the open access rights for this one. The Tobin Project did, but we're kind of claiming open access series. And so you'll be getting notice of more volumes to come. So the 3 panelists for today are, again, authors of different chapters. Liesel Hines is an assistant professor of European and Eurasian Studies at Johns Hopkins, SAIS, and Professor Hines studies arenas in which struggles over various forms of identity, national, ethnic, religious, and gender take place. She's written a lot, contributed to a lot of different journals. Chapter is well worth reading, and we'll be talking about that in a moment. Scott Mainwaring is the Eugene P. and Helen Connolly Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. He's also a faculty fellow at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies. David Moss is the Paul Winton Charrington Professor at the Harvard Business School. He also founded and directs the Tobin Project. At HBS, he teaches business government, and in the Biggie program, business government and international political economy. He is right now also, in addition to the putting together this volume, doing a bunch of stuff for Tobin, leading a very exciting initiative on using historical case studies of democracy as teaching vehicles for high school teachers and high school students all over the country. And hopefully he'll talk about that in just a moment. Now, before we kind of get started and I hand the microphone over in a structured question and answer, I'd like to do a little bit of audience engagement. And this is an audience engagement exercise about democratic culture. Is the screen sharing up? Okay, so if everyone could get the democratic culture as a theme that figures importantly in many chapters in the book. So if everyone could get out their device and go to, hold on, whoa. How come this isn't working? Archon Fung, wait, hold on a second. Hold on, sorry about that little technical error.
You want to give us the address?
Yes, I do. This should work better. Is that sharing? It's not even sharing. So of course that's not working better. Can you see that? QR code? Okay, great. So you can either scan the QR code or the address is polev.com/arfung. And then when you go there, think about the issues, political issues that you're very deeply committed to. It could be a woman's right to choose. It could be the idea that life begins at conception. It could be the idea that we have a right to bear arms. It could be that gun violence prevention is really, really important to you. Could be defunding the police. It could be increasing the number of police for secure communities. But 3 topics that are really, really important to you that you care a lot about. And is the polling open?
No.
Is it open now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. 2 responses so far. Okay, so keep typing them in. So we've got violence, education, community safety, debate, LGBTQ rights, climate change. Great. This is excellent. I'll wait till we have a few more results. So everybody should have 3 in their minds, even if you don't have time to type in 3. Have 3 in your mind. So people have a lot of issues that they care about. The nice thing about the Kennedy schools, no matter what of these issues it is, there's probably a place to learn more about it and do something about it here. Okay, very good. Now, so keep those issues in your mind, okay? And now I want to ask you a second question. And is the polling open now? Oh, somebody answered. I didn't even give you the question yet. Okay, so the question is this. Now listen carefully. Now imagine for each of these 3 issues that you care deeply about, you simply lost in a fair democratic process. The other side got more votes, right? For how many of those issues would you be willing to say, indeed eager to say, I didn't get my way, it's kind of too bad. The other side won. For the next few years, I'll just try to convince more people. And I'll go along, not because I have to, because I'll go to jail if I don't, but because I want to. I actually want to lose in this case, because to me, the value of democracy is more important than the 3 issues, 1, 2, or 3 that I just listed in my head. For how many of those issues would you be willing to endorse that statement? I'll go along, not because I have to, but because I want to. Is it 0 issues? Is it 1 issue? Is it 2 issues? Or is it all 3 issues for which you'd be willing to say that? No pushback. There's a lot of different ways to push. Oh, I'm worried about rights. I'm worried about minority tyranny. I'm worried about misinformation. A lot of worries. Just answer the question. Okay, 30 responses. We'll go to 35. Okay, let's see what we got. I'm really curious. I've done this poll once before. Oh, wow. Okay, so 14% of people, 0 issues. 30%, they'd be willing to give on 1. 24%, 2. And a full third of the room, all 3 issues, which is higher than the last time I gave it. Now, so this is a question about democratic culture, because I submit to you, for the people answering 0 or 1, maybe you're not a small d Democrat. Maybe you're a justice authoritarian in the sense that you have an idea of justice that's different from a lot of other people's ideas of justice, and you prefer or are willing to insist on your idea of justice, even if a democracy goes the other way. And it's okay to be a justice authoritarian. The point of this exercise is simply to point out the tension of how difficult it is to be a small d Democrat. And to maintain your Democrat, it's easy to say I'm for democracy, but this is what it costs you to be for democracy. And one reason I submit why democracy is fragile in so many societies is too many justice authoritarians, not enough small d Democrats. All right. So so remember the democratic culture point as we kind of go on. All right. Hopefully that'll go back to the Zoom screen. Okay. So we thought we'd organize the discussion with a little bit of a structured interview back and forth with the three panelists. And so I'll ask David some questions, and then Liesel some questions, and then Scott some questions, and then we'll mix it up. Okay, so first question is for David, along with John Sesterino, John, raise your hand. So I think it's fair to say that many of us contributed to the volume, but you two were the prime movers who led the scholarship and writing and corralling of all of us. So David, can you just say a few words about what you'd hope this volume would do, especially in light of, like, if you were to collect all of the volumes on democratic backsliding right now, it would probably be a couple of bookshelves. So what did you hope that this book would do, and how would it be distinctive from much of the other scholarship on democratic backsliding?
So thanks for that question and for that introduction to this whole topic. So look, I would say that the main difference is there's a great burgeoning literature on backsliding, on fragility of democracy, of the rise of populism, so many different pieces. Most of that work, not quite all, but much of it, really starts with a current day problem. And says, why have we seen a rise of populism? Why are we seeing fragility? Why are we seeing backsliding? And then tries to understand that, often drawing on history, sometimes not, but really starting with the current day problem and working out from there. What we tried to do in this volume is really quite different, which is we're looking at the problem of democratic breakdown. And then that's sort of the center, and wherever it occurs. I think, are there lessons one can draw for the present? Probably, and people can think, right, people can think about that. But that wasn't actually the principal objective. The principal objective was to understand these cases and these problems. So we picked 11 episodes of democratic breakdown, tried to understand those. So if you think about two books, so an old one, Juan Lin's and Alfred Stepan, that wrote the breakdown of democratic regime. So this is back in the 1970s. That was something very similar to what we're doing. And we thought that needed an update. So that's over 40 years old, and we thought a lot has been learned since then. If you think about another book, Levitsky and Ziblatt, How Democracies Die, that fits sort of what I just described of starting with, let's try to understand this current problem and working there. So those are two different types of books. We're sort of more in the tradition of the Juan Lin's. I think both are, I hope are very important, these two traditions, but we're kind of in the look at the episode, try to understand it, and then see what we draw from it. Yeah.
Great. Excellent. And so this is this book, and I hope people should go to the webpage. Maybe you're not all on Zoom, so we can't just post it in the chat. But all the chapters are available on the Tobin Project website, and I think a link to that landing page is also on the event page on the ASH site. So you can read all of these, along with the introduction, these 11 case studies, which range enormously widely from 5th century BC Athens to World War II period, to the Weimar Republic and the rise of the Nazi regime there, to current day Turkey and Venezuela and Russia. So a wide range of cases across many centuries. Do you see any common patterns or dynamics across these 11 cases?
Yeah. So there's both pretty significant differences across, and then there are some commonalities. Maybe one way to think about this is sort of very standard distinction. Anyone who's sort of looked at democratic breakdown, there's pretty, standard view in the literature that there's two types of breakdown, broadly speaking. There's fast and there's slow. Okay, so not surprisingly, and fast, if you think about the breakdown of Weimar democracy in Weimar Germany and the Nazi seizure of power, this is far oversimplifying, and I'm going to come back to this in a second, but think about, broadly speaking, Hitler becomes chancellor, is appointed as chancellor after getting more seats in the Reichstag than anybody else, his party. He's appointed chancellor. Then there's the Reichstag fire in February, I think it's February 27th, and then he takes emergency powers after that. So often a view is there's democracy right around the time Hitler comes in, and maybe at the time of the Reichstag fire and the emergency powers, you go from, that's the breakdown of democracy. So it's almost from one day to the next. Sort of the polar opposite in this is, say, Venezuela in more recent times, where Chavez comes in 1998, and you continue to have multi-party elections. But what you see over time is a chipping away at the right to dissent, the right to oppose, the right to contest. You see checks on presidential power are weakened in various ways. It's hard to say what day or what week or what month you move from a democracy to not a democracy anymore. But somewhere over years, you are seeing that, right? And by the time you get to Maduro and today, you've actually seen a dramatic breakdown. So their liberal democracy score in Venezuela looks like Cuba at this point. So it's been a dramatic change. So there's this kind of fast, slow idea. And one thing I would say that comes out of these chapters, in fact, we were really struck, all of them, is that although there's a fast, slow distinction, I don't want to suggest it's not there, it is, but in all of the cases of fast, you actually see erosion, democratic erosion, long before you see the breakdown. And usually years can be decades. And that those elements of erosion seem interesting. And so in a sense, there's a gradualness to this, which the fast, slow distinction a little bit aligns. So, I don't want to say that distinction doesn't exist. There's a difference between the breakdown in Germany and the breakdown in Venezuela, but the German case, there was a long buildup to it. Mm-hmm. So then we looked at these types of erosion, and they're all different. So you get differences across the cases, but there were three types of erosion that were arguably, you can quibble about a couple of the cases, but were in all of the 11 episodes that we looked at. And so in all 11, you see the rise of anti-democratic actors, major political actors who are really challenging democracy, and in many cases, not quite all, but in many, explicitly so. So in many, you see explicitly anti-democratic actors. Two, you see a rise of political violence, and really quite intense in many cases, so often involving political killings. But so you see that growing. And you also see extreme political polarization, which in some instances infects not only sort of the general public, but also institutions. Institutions like the military, for example, might become clearly identified politically. So those are three. I don't want to suggest those three types of erosion are the most important three. They just happen, either they happen to be, or maybe there's more than happenstance, but these three seem to be in all of the cases, arguably. There are other types of erosion, like limits on speech rights, for example, which occur in some or many, but not all. So, anyway, I would say this finding about erosion is interesting. And then thinking about the elements of erosion. And then if I can just take one more step, I would say my own view, and I think many people, but I don't want to suggest all the authors and co-editors agree on this. They might, I don't know. But I think that there is some degree of agreement that behind these elements of erosion could be a little bit going back to where Archon was starting with democratic culture. So that when you have a culture of democracy, a commitment to democracy, which is weakening, and there's atrophy there, that is what it maybe, in a sense, allows these various types of erosion. And so it's possible that what's connecting these things is something that is very, very hard to measure, very hard to see, but we could talk more about it, but it's something we can think about democratic culture. And so, my sense is when you try to think about repair, you can focus on the individual elements of erosion, which is important in any given society, but maybe this culture element, people's belief, their commitment to democracy may be at the heart of that. That's going beyond what we found in the book, but but we suggest that. Yeah.
And then last question before moving to Liesel. So among political scientists thinking about democratic breakdown and democratic erosion, this kind of takes off a little bit what you just said. I think you can divide up the explanations into two different sides. And so this both goes to the democratic culture is common to both. So Gregor Eichart wrote a really nice paper that I just read last week. He's the director of the Center for European Studies here and important comparative political scientist. He distinguished between the supply side of politics, that is the leaders, and the demand side of politics, that is the people. And so, to caricature a couple of my colleagues, you can think of Steve and Dan's book, How Democracies Die, is focusing on the supply side. It's the leaders who are breaking democratic norms and don't exercise institutional forbearance and the rest. And it's they who are not adhering to the culture of democracy, and that's who's causing the problem. Another colleague, Pippa Norris, I think is very squarely on the demand side, right? It's the culture of politics, and in particular, kind of authoritarian culture as a broad-based kind of political behavior and political opinion phenomenon that is doing the work. Do you have views, or did you glean views about where the culprit lies? Is it more on the supply side of leadership or the demand side of defective people?
So it's a great question and a great problem, and it's one I would say we did not resolve. Authors, I think, went in with some disagreement about this question and came out with some disagreement about this question. I think even among the four of us, there may be some disagreement on this question. So I don't think we've resolved it. I do think it's unusually important. And I mean, I'll say, maybe just speaking for myself, certainly not for the authors or other co-editors, but just speaking for myself, I guess I'm more in the camp of the general public. And maybe I'll just say why, but so I would go, I wouldn't frame it in exactly the way you did, maybe sort of going with sort of this authoritarian view. I think I would think, in fact, I worry about that word. My sense is many of the people who may have seen their faith in democracy weaken, some might have a leaning toward a more authoritarian setting, but I think many wouldn't think about it that way. I think they think about it more that there are certain issues they want, they're worried, they're losing faith in democracy, but I'm not sure that they have necessarily great faith in some alternatives. So I don't know that that's the pivot. I think that if you could measure people's commitment to democracy, you did it in one way, there are other ways you could maybe do that. If you could measure commitment to democracy, that in a sense would be one way of getting at what is a strong democratic culture. And I have a sense that when that is weak, you can almost always, this is why I guess I favor the broader view, I think you could almost always find political leaders who'd be willing to step in and appeal to those who have a weaker commitment to democratic process or norms. And so while I think the political leaders are important, I have a feeling that if you're seeing weakness in the general public, you will soon get to. Right. And that for sure, if there's breakdown among the leaders, that's bad. But I think that's almost inevitable if the public is supporting a strong, my view. I think that there are others who I respect greatly and worry about my own view for this reason, is they really say, no, you've got to look at the party leaders, the elected officials, and it's when they fall down on the job that you get into trouble. That's not an issue we resolved in this book, I'm afraid.
That's great.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, everyone should kind of keep in mind those two dynamics as you think about the societies that you're concerned with. Okay, so let me welcome Liesel to the conversation, who's calling from Bologna. Yeah, that's great. Thank you for staying up for this event. So she wrote a fantastic chapter on Turkey, lots and lots of questions. We'll only have time for a few of them, but I think probably most people in the room, I'm guessing, I myself, one of my priors is that civilian control over the military is a very, very good thing in itself and good for democracy. And in your chapter, you make the argument that Turkey did a bunch of stuff to increase civilian control over the military and was cheered on by the EU. And part of the reason Turkey did that was for EU ascension, but then it had this effect that for me is very, very counterintuitive, which it contributed to democratic erosion. So two questions there. One is, can you say a little bit more about why my intuition is just so wrong in the Turkish case? And then also, I'm not in the EU, I don't know anything about Turkey or Europe, but presumably EU officials do. So why didn't they see this coming that you explain in retrospect?
Thank you so much for the question and for framing that way. I think as political scientists, we're always really interested in puzzles. So anything that kind of looks counterintuitive is a great jumping off point for us. I also want to thank the organizers, the editors. I feel really lucky to be a part of this project. So taking as this idea, the role of the military, and it kind of speaks to a point that David just made earlier about the potential danger of the military taking on a very strong political stance and the implications that might have for, checks and balances and lots of rule of law, things that we think of going along naturally with democracy. But I think the important thing to recognize is that while civilian control of the military is often thought of as a good in and of itself, it depends on the nature of civilian control. And, the extent to which those elites are committed to democracy to tie into Scott's piece a bit. And also kind of thinking about the ways that elites can use, for example, international institutions' conditionality as a way to create a space for their own political projects that institutions like the military might have been preventing them from accessing. So the military in Turkey, for example, this is the case in other countries, but certainly for Turkey, played sort of a guardianship or tutelary role since the founding of the republic. It saw itself as the embodiment of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk's values, secularism, republicanism, nationalism, and really took its role quite seriously against what it saw as threats to that. And they identified those threats as predominantly Islamism, leftism, and Kurdish nationalism. And so what you saw was a very illiberal approach to politics in the sense that minority rights were not, permissible. Headscarves were banned in universities. You couldn't speak Kurdish in public. So there was very much this sense that the military thought it needed to stay in power. So what happens is you have this Justice and Development Party that comes from a tradition of political Islam come into power. And they see the EU and they see, thinking along the lines that you outlined, these accession criteria that are pointing towards civilian control of the military. Sounds good, right? This is something that we can sort of sell to the international public and is sort of a way of marginalizing or reconfiguring or reducing this institutional obstacle that had, thrown out political parties in our tradition of political Islam, had contributed to, closing down parties in this particular political tradition. So again, it really depends on the nature of the civilian control that comes into power. So the AKP, the Justice and Development Party, is able to use the EU accession process to, again, sort of reduce the role of the military in line with accession criteria, reconfigure the judiciary in line with accession criteria. And so to get to the second part of your question, there's this counterintuitive idea that the military should step back from politics. But what you sort of have is almost the replacement of one non-democratic regime with another non-democratic regime, just of a very different character. And I think the reason that EU leaders didn't necessarily see this coming, I can think of a couple of reasons, and some of them are perhaps more cynical than others. One would be that I think there were some prominent EU leaders that didn't really see Turkey's pathway as a possibility in the first place. I think that they were not necessarily convinced that Turkey would ever be able to fulfill the accession criteria. And even if they could, it's too big and too Muslim anyway. This was the kind of language that was coming from Angela Merkel, from Nicolas Sarkozy, and so forth. And it's worth noting that that language has effects, right? When you're a populist nationalist leader and you can point to the EU and say, look, they were never going to let us in the first place, that's powerful stuff, right? So that kind of rhetoric matters. I would say at the time, so the Justice and Development Party comes in 2003. So this is, 2 years post 9/11. And this is the time when the international community is searching for a model of Muslim democratic combination. They're trying to find some way to have a Muslim partner in the region and some kind of example, or what would come to be called the Turkish model, right? And what that model looked like wasn't ever super specified. Is it Islam and democracy? Is it economic growth? Like in the Middle East, what is it? But I think there was an eagerness to identify a potential democratic ally in the region. And so there was a willingness to accept, and this is, I think, the third reason, the kinds of rhetoric that the AKP was using. The AKP, cognizant of its past, was very, very explicit about saying, we're not a Muslim democratic party, we're not an Islamist party, we're a conservative democratic party, like, say, the CDU in Germany. We have, Islam is important to us, but we won't legislate along those lines. And yet it comes from a tradition that was very, very driven towards doing so. So I think it's a combination of those factors in terms of why the EU was, and even I would say some people in Turkey who were excited about the idea of going to come in and potentially recognize Kurdish rights, potentially talk about the Armenian genocide, open up universities to women with headscarves. And so they were willing to accept this position the AKP was putting forward without necessarily thinking about, okay, what are the potential consequences and what direction might this go in? Not necessarily is Islam bad for democracy, not that at all, but how much control does this particular party and this particular leader of this party want in the end?
Oh, that's so interesting. So, following up on that a little bit, I don't know, it's hard to get into the mindset of non-democratic political leaders, or maybe any political leader, but I want to ask you a little bit to try to step into Erdogan's mindset a little bit, right? So in the following way, so he said that his project in Turkey is not anti-democratic, but illiberal democracy, right? And so in a way, to me, that's kind of understandable, because part of the military's national secularist project is liberal but not democratic in a country where the vast majority of people are Muslim, right? And so he's trying to arguably give voice to those preferences in law and public policy. So that's illiberal, but not necessarily undemocratic. But then, your chapter says, well, yes, but then there's a lot of undemocratic stuff too. And that goes into undermining institutions of dissent, rigging the judiciary, rigging elections. So there's both, what begins as illiberal democracy ends up as neither liberal nor democratic, right? So there's a slide there. I wonder, either in the public statements of the AKP or your understandings of the internal reasoning, what is their internal logic? So is it still that we are giving voice to this 90% and we don't need elections to do that? So it's still, I guess, our populist democratic without the electoral mechanism in check? Or is it something like arguments that I've heard both Democrats and Republicans make in the United States for gerrymandering and money in politics, which is, it's a political game, and part of the political game is trying to rig the rules of the political game, and that's what we're doing, and the other side can try to do the same. So what's your complaint?
Yeah, so putting myself in Erdogan's head is a bit of a scary proposition, but it's my job, right? My job is to use and manipulate all the different sources that I can to try to understand what is the logic that's driving these individuals. And I think the first thing to understand, and what I like about this, is that it, I think, contributes to some of the distinctions that David was talking about in terms of sort of, how do we define democracy? And I think that there are very different definitions of what democracy is across these cases. And for Erdogan, and I think for a lot of his followers in particular, democracy is the ballot box. That it's a very, very electoral understanding. If you win, you get to set the rules of the system, is sort of his understanding. What I think is really important to consider about this, and often in political science, we like to see kind of bifurcations of, oh, it's either instrumentalist or it's constructivist, right? It's either you're instrumentally strategically trying to get these votes, or, constitutively, you super believe that this is the right thing to do. And it's absolutely a mix of the two, I would say. He does have this, understanding of democracy at the ballot box. And one thing I think that is important to understand in Turkey is that while, the military has intervened in politics many times, while Kurdish rights, free speech, all of those things were curtailed long before the AKP came into power, the ballot box and kind of the will of the people at the elections is kind of sacred. The first time that you have multi-party elections in serious open multi-party elections in 1950, the ruling party, the founding party of the republic, loses, and they say, okay, handover of power. That's what we're going to do. Rigging elections is extraordinarily difficult in Turkey. So the AKP is kind of looking at what the ballot box says goes, for both instrumental and I think constitutive reasons. Now, do they take every possible step, use every tool in the authoritarian toolkit to be able to make sure that they win at the ballot box? Yes. And that involves, everything from a political economy configuration that means that 90 to 94% of the media is basically under AKP control, because holding companies own media outlets, but they also have construction interests and banking interests and mining interests, which means that they have, a significant motivation to show pro-AKP coverage on television, right? So that's already kind of creating this crony capitalism atmosphere. You have kind of the population of universities with rectors who are sympathetic to the AKP, violating the standard of having elected rectors. And I think it's really important to look at these kind of non-traditional, political scientists were often interested in the legislature and the judiciary and so forth. But I think looking at the media and looking at the education system helps us understand how individuals' beliefs are formed, but also how authoritarians try to target those particular institutions. Again, recognizing that, everybody in Turkey takes their elections extraordinarily seriously. So there's very much a sense that if I win, I rule as I want. And as you were saying, the AKP, at least in recent years, has taken on a more nationalist tone, a more populist tone. So it's very much us versus them. It's not, Muslims versus non-Muslims. It's pious Muslims, the real Muslims, the true kind of nation, as it were. And with that, he's talking about those who adhere to his understanding of what a good Muslim is, as opposed to those who might have other understandings. So again, I think there's a sense that it's a game, perhaps, that you can sort of, if you're in power, you can structure the rules as you want. You have the authority to do so. I think it's very much the case, as we've seen in other countries like Hungary, that the AKP comes into power multiple times: 2002, 2007, 2011. They keep getting reelected. But then they start to really change the rules as they go: constitutional reforms, more and more electoral manipulation to be able to stay in power. And I'll end on this. At this point, it is fundamentally existential. If Erdogan loses power, he is either going directly to jail or something worse is going to happen. So the amount of import for him, for his family, for his cronies, for those who have secured their access to patronage, there's so much that they have invested in this, that they're willing to kind of push the boundaries of, oh, those are definitely not free and they're pretty much not fair. Sorry, we really can't call them either free or fair. So there's an element of risk that they're willing to take. And in this last election in May 2023, which took place after I'd submitted the chapter, but I kind of I guess maybe saw what was going to happen. They were able to secure that election victory. There was a lot of electoral tilting of the playing field that allowed them to do so. But there's also a strong sort of political economy and identity base behind the AKP that just hasn't turned its back on the ruling elites despite their de-democratization.
That's so interesting. So I just want to recap a little bit what you said and lead into the last question for you, which is, I think both ordinary people and scholars focus on different components of democracy, and the most like above the waterline part of the iceberg is, does everybody get to vote and are the votes counted properly? And you're saying like in Turkey, everybody's got their eye on that, and that's super important. And then in the United States and some other places, there's a layer under which is about manipulating the franchise, hiding the mailboxes, or the lines are really long, or the machines aren't evenly distributed, right? Still like pretty close to the ballot box stuff. And then under that is political institutions like the judiciary and the laws of voting. And then you pay a lot of attention to a factor which a lot of people in American politics don't pay very much attention to. Comparativists are oftentimes better, but to what's happening in civil society and business, and Erdogan kind of lining up with the concrete industry for building and replacing the university rectors and controlling the media environment, right? And that's like way below the waterline for a lot of, even for a lot of scholars, much less for a lot of observers. If you had to, so one quick question is like, to you, to hear you, listen to you, it sounds like the vote counting part is kind of actually working a little bit better than it is in the United States in the last couple presidential cycles. Is that true? And then second, what about the below the water? Important is that the civil society and economy part compared to the political leadership and manipulation at that level in political institutions part?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question. A great majority of my work is targeted at kind of below the waterline, looking at the role of the media, even entertainment media, which I'll talk a little bit about super briefly. But in terms of the sort of the integrity of the electoral process, again, there's no sense that these are fair, right? Opposition members are in jail. The previous head of the pro-Kurdish party was in jail. You've got numerous politicians in jail. You've got numerous journalists who are jailed. You've got basically no access to media exposure for the opposition. It's very heavily weighted in the incumbent's favor. So there's all these ways that it's not fair. But in terms of free, can you cast your ballot for the party that you want? And is that ballot counted for the party that you want? That is much more difficult to manipulate. And this is why I say people in Turkey take their elections extraordinarily seriously. You have civil society electoral monitoring organizations. You have individuals who can sign up to go to their local precincts and serve as election observers. Opposition parties can also serve as election observers. You have a clear ballot box. And at the end of the voting day, everybody watches every ballot counted and then has to sign off. Now, can it be manipulated? It can. And we saw a little bit of that while the voting announcement was delayed during the first round of elections. It looked like some votes were electronically shifted towards one of the incumbent party's coalition partners. But that's really tough to do. And so I think that's something that is important in terms of the elections. And by the way, yes, voting is mandatory in Turkey, but people show out and turn up in droves. And then the fine for not showing up is pretty low. But people are like 88, 90, 90%. We get immense amounts of turnout. People take it extraordinarily seriously. But so then if we go kind of down below the waterline, I like that metaphor. I think it's incredibly important to look at how does that electoral playing field become tilted in the first place? And how do you ensure that the incumbent gets media exposure? Well, you give the bridge tender to a company that's owned by a holding outlet that has pro-media stations, right? Or you, I think the concrete example, the construction industry, which has fueled so much of the growth that helped the AKP, this economic growth that helped the AKP expand its voter base beyond pious Sunni Muslims. Lots of people were interested in the tangible goods that they were able to hand out. That construction industry was built on so much crony capitalism that when you have this earthquake in February, how many buildings collapsed that shouldn't have collapsed? The airport in Hatay was built on a fault line. You had people who were able to buy amnesty permits so that their unstructured building could stay in place. So the real societal consequences of this, I think, are not even just at the ballot box, but sort of when the country is tested by something like a natural disaster. So that's where we can see how much the government has been able to extend its influence, yes, into the judiciary, yes, into reconfiguring the military and changing its education system, and changing its leadership, but also into the media, into the construction industries, into civil society, to the extent that even entertainment programming is not only heavily censored formally, but also has a culture of self-censorship whereby people are afraid to, to put something in a television show, in a soap opera that might offend the government, because as we saw, they can put a ban on that, or that people are afraid to tweet because then they're going to be put on a blacklist and then they're not going to get hired. So it's these lower level, I think, forms of autocratization, of constriction of the space in which free speech can be expressed, from the media, which we normally think is like a check and balance, right? Independent criticism, the education system, we think about intellectual freedom. Well, if you take away the rector of Boğaziçi University, one of the premier public universities in Turkey, that's putting a big clamp on that. So I won't take on the question of comparatively which should we weight more heavily, but I will say that I think as political scientists, it's incumbent upon us to look at some of these other institutions and see the integral role that they play in de-democratization.
Thank you very much. This is so interesting. So we're moving now from Europe to Latin America. It is worth noting that last week was the 50th anniversary of the overthrow of Allende, of Salvador Allende, and the installation of General Pinochet's regime in Chile. But the Scots chapter is not about Chile. It's about Argentina, which he writes during the 70s as the world champion of democratic erosion, which is quite a claim that we'll explore. And he is definitely the one who has the knowledge to make that claim. So the first question here kind of goes to democratic norms, but on the leadership side. So in the chapter, you write that one of the main reasons for this episode of breakdown of democracy, erosion of democracy in Argentina, is the lack of anybody's commitment to democracy in this moment, or any of the important political actors. So I kind of want to go back to my initial exercise with the idea that it's pretty easy to be committed to democracy when it doesn't cost you too much in terms of your interests, right? And the whole poll question is about, well, what happens when democracy really costs you in terms of your interests? Do you still stick with it? And many people said no, right? And this is, I think, is especially true for political leaders. So I can't think of too many capital E Democrats or Republicans who would say no to gerrymandering if it hurts their political chances of election. And that's a pretty clear case, I think, in which democracy and interest can clash. So to sustain the claim, right, the counterfactual is there could have been leaders in Argentina more committed to democracy than these were. So can you talk about that? Can you think of leaders in Argentina in this period, or not in this period because it's their absence, prior periods or future periods, or in other contexts you feel like, yeah, these leaders are committed to democratic norms, even when it costs them their interests, and that's what it looks like, and that's what Argentina needed more of in this moment?
Great, thank you.
Very interesting question. So let me just say, of course, I agree with your point about gerrymandering in the US. Both parties do pretty much as much gerrymandering as they can. And with modern statistics, they've gotten really, really good at great precision with gerrymandering. But at the same time, I think that there is a long history I'll first talk a bit about the US, of not exercising power to the nth degree, even at the expense of democracy. And let me begin with the interesting example of George Washington, right?
Right.
Washington, like other founding fathers, was not a Democrat, but he was a Republican, and he was someone who cared deeply about the public good in the United States. So what did he do after 8 years in power? Did he decide, no, I'm going to become the king of the United States? No, he didn't. For the good of the country, he said, I'm stepping down after 2 terms. And that was a norm that minimized, it did not maximize his own power. I don't want to say it maximized democracy, but it was a Republican good. And every president after that who had 2 terms followed that norm until 1940, of course. They didn't have to do that, but they chose to. I think we have to, for politicians, except for people like Nelson Mandela or a few others like him, Nehru, Gandhi, we cannot look for heroic gestures on behalf of democracy. I think for the most part, what democratic commitment means for politicians and parties is restraint in how they exercise power. And we don't usually, restraint isn't visible. We don't usually think about it. It's not visible in a quotidian way. But does that make it less real? No. And let me give you some, I think, I want to evoke the two notions that Levitsky and Ziblatt coined in their 2018 book, both of which I think are very fruitful. The Democrats exercise institutional forbearance. That is to say, they don't exercise hardball at every occasion, and that they engage in mutual tolerance. David will know this great book by Richard Hofstadter, right, on the emergence of mutual tolerance, a 1969 book, as an essential underpinning of democratization in the US. Again, it means you don't kill your opponent, you don't crush the adversary, even if you have the power that you could do it. So let me give just a few examples of what it means concretely to exercise democratic restraint or forbearance and engage in mutual toleration. One which is really important in Latin America and Africa is you don't overturn term limits beyond 2 terms, right? In other words, even if you have the power in Congress to have term limits overturned, you don't do that. You say 2 terms is 2 terms and I'm out, right? When you see people grabbing for more than 2 terms, that is a really bad sign for democracy. You don't rewrite the Constitution at every turn in order to enhance your own power. You don't impeach when you can, except under extraordinary circumstances, right? You don't claim electoral fraud. You accept electoral losses when you've lost, right? I mean, people could always claim electoral fraud. They could always claim that they won. But the norm in most of US history, at least certainly post-1965 history, is you acknowledge losses. You don't demonize the opposition or the press. So they're exercises of democratic restraint or democratic commitment that we don't usually see or think about until we've seen the opposite. And then these forms of restraint become more visible to us. We can start to think about them more. To Liessel's very interesting example, you don't stack the public sector with your own loyalists, and you don't fire opposition members of the public sector without due cause, because you recognize that it's your democratic duty to follow these basic norms. You don't engage in massive plundering of the state or allow your allies to do it. Examples where, I think that parties or politicians purposefully accepted losses in the name of democracy. I'm going to start with 2 examples that are perverse examples, because they both really backfired in very important ways. But in Colombia and Venezuela in the 80s, the parties that had been dominant for a while recognized that democracy had really pretty sharp limitations. So they pursued measures, decentralization among others, electoral reform, constitutional reform, to open the system. They were exactly right that they should have done that. And they did it knowing that this would mean that they would no longer necessarily be as dominant as they had been. I think we could, think of many more examples. India, right? India 1947 to 64, India in the 80s. Even with overwhelming majorities in the National Assembly, the Congress Party did not crushed the opposition. Nehru did not say, you know, I have these overwhelming majorities. I'm going to govern for the Hindu majority. No, he did exactly the opposite. He said, this democracy has to be for all Indians, regardless of caste, religion, language, etc. So, I mean, I think those are just some partial responses.
Those are great. I love you can't expect politicians to be heroic, but you can expect them on good days to exercise restraint. And restraint is the thing that you don't see until the opposite happens, which is, and there's some of the opposite happening now. So we're seeing it. Great points. So the chapter on Argentina is just fantastic and pretty depressing. And so one of the depressing parts is the extremism and polarization, right? So you write the super compelling argument that the polarization and extremism just grows and grows and grows until it's hard to see anything other than a breaking point. And you write at the height of the conflict, there was something like one assassination every 5 hours and one bomb explosion every 3, right? Which is an extreme amount of just political violence. And on the right wing, there's death squads, and on the left, there's some bombings and some of these the kidnappings and assassinations, right? And so it seems by that point, polarization and extremism have gotten so far that it seems like it's hard to see governing with the other side. If you're on the left, how can you see governing with a death squad sympathetic party and vice versa? So I guess the question is, could you have seen pulling back from democratic erosion at that point? Or is there a point at which the extremism and polarization is just like, okay, there's just no turning back. It's just like there is no plausible way in which either side is going to accept governing with the other or losing to the other, in the sense that, in the poll sense that I tried a little bit at the beginning of the session.
Right. I mean, I do think that I was a student of Juan Linz and Al Steppen, so I do believe that there were opportunities for democratic reequilibration along the way.
Okay.
It became increasingly difficult to achieve democratic reequilibration. And it became increasingly difficult in part because I make the argument in the chapter that one of the many indications that Juan Perón was not a Democrat was his appointment of his wife as vice president. Now, I mean, right, this was not a wife who was qualified to be president. She had a very precarious education and very little political experience. It was just an appointment of expediency, right? Completely opportunistic and completely in the vein of a loyalist appointment. But he was old and in fragile health when he became president, so that was dreadful. When she became president, she turned her primary advisor was a right-wing politician who directly funded the right-wing death squads in Argentina. And the chances for reequilibration under such a bad president were very poor. But I mean, to go back to an earlier example that we invoked, that David invoked, right? Germany. I mean, you could say that German democracy was on its deathbed by the very beginning of the 1930s, when almost everything was happening as rule by decree, right? And yet I think there were still possibilities, increasingly difficult with a 43% unemployment rate and so forth, but there were still possibilities for reequilibration. And in Argentina, there certainly could, under a different president, there could have been possibilities for reequilibration. In October 1975, Isabel Perón stepped down because of a health crisis as president, and the Congress could have impeached her at that time or could have removed her from office and installed someone else. Now, at that point, or at Germany in the early 1930s, I think we would have been talking about a democracy with very severe deficits, right? A semi-democracy with a lot of severe democratic gaps. But we needn't have gone to Hitler, and we needn't have gone to the kind of state terror that occurred in Argentina from March 1976 until, until December 1983. So yes, I think you can pull back from the brink. At some moment in Argentina, I would say this moment was probably when the Congress failed to impeach Isabel in October 1975, and when she insisted on returning to power. I think at that point, there was probably no pulling back.
Good. So this is the last question on our little exchange, and then we'll open it up. So tee up your questions. So every time I give a fair number of talks on democracy, and inevitably every time somebody is like, is democracy really so great? And so last night somebody said, well, what about the ethical authoritarian? And my answer is always no, democracy is better than the ethical authoritarian, categorically. But the Argentina case leads me to question that, right? So I could see in this moment of extremism and polarization, bombs going off every few hours, political assassinations happening all the time. And you're right, like the business community, a bunch of people who have like serious stakes in the society think this democracy is a bust. We'd just be better off with authoritarians, and in this case, the military coup, and supported the coup for that reason. But the coup didn't pan out like those people thought it would. And that's kind of where your chapter leaves off. So I guess what I'm asking is, why didn't the coup deliver for the people who supported it and thought, well, at least that'll be better than this chaos that we have now?
Right, and not only was it a lot of the establishment that was delighted when the coup finally came, the reception among common citizens was, we don't have clear percentages, but we have very clear indications that most people were very happy when the coup came. Why didn't it work out? Well, I mean, first of all, you do have the Lee Kuan Yews, who are great state builders, the ethical authoritarians, right? And they can do a lot of, but let's be clear too, they are the outliers, right? I mean, for every Lee Kuan Yew, there are 2 Hugo Chavez's and Putin's and Mugabe's, right? These predatory, clientelistic, patrimonial leaders who engage in theft. And that's their primary gig, right, is engaging in theft. And that's part of what happened in Argentina, right? I mean, so partly these rulers, they were predatory rulers. I think adding to that, they were grossly inept in terms of economic policy. So that's when the tide really turned against the dictators in Argentina, the economic crisis. A second thing that really turned the tide against the dictators in Argentina was they engaged in this reckless, stupid war against the United Kingdom. And guess who won? Guess who won, right? Would you bet on Argentina or the United Kingdom in a war? Well, they thought the United Kingdom wouldn't respond. Well, Margaret Thatcher decided otherwise. And so I just happened to, I was going to visit my closest friend in Argentina. I think I arrived in Argentina the day after the war ended, but there was still all of this nationalistic stuff on the radio about a great Argentine triumph. What triumph, right? Several hundred Argentines died. The material devastation was great. But then the third thing, and I mean, sequentially, the third thing was that after the collapse of the dictatorship, because of the economic crisis and then the war, these immensely courageous people who had been protesting human rights abuses to great silence for years, right? their voices started to be heard. And you start to see, massive demonstrations about human rights and a massive cultural outpouring about the human rights situation. So if you went to Argentina in 1984 or 85, every day, the top story on the TV news was about human rights abuses. And you can see that in the great movie, which was released late last year, Argentina 1985. Every day that was the top story. So people people who had been able to not acknowledge what had taken place they were forced to acknowledge it. It was in their face every day. And so that too became part of the narrative of why we have to have democracy.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And obviously the deep knowledge about all of these societies and the dynamics of constructing and democracy and democratic erosion. So any comments or questions from the audience? Yes, the lady in front.
My name is Hasna Modood. I'm a former fellow at Ash Center and now visiting Bangladesh. I'm from Bangladesh and speaks a lot. The present head of government, party head, has been ruling Bangladesh for the last 18 years without being properly elected. And she now wants one more or two more terms. And in the rise of huge corruption cases and huge human rights abuses, even American government, European government, all governments of the democratic Western democracies are putting a pressure on this government. Then the demand of the opposition is there should be a free and fair election under a caretaker government, because all the previous elections were held under the government in power, and where no one was allowed to cast their vote unless they were voting and for the government, and it was called midnight election. I would like to have some opinion and some comments from you. How do we go from where we are in Bangladesh? Thank you.
Bangladesh expertise, anybody? Thank you for informing us about the situation. Maybe take another quick question. Yeah, wherever, I'll track the microphone. Melissa, wherever you want to go.
Hi. Freddy Guevara from Venezuela. I'm an MCMPA candidate and also a research assistant from the Ash Center in the Nonviolent Action Lab with Professor Erika Chenoweth. And one of the things that I'm trying to work with they is about why civil resistance movements have been failing the last decades, right? Because the successful rate was like 70% in the previous decades, and now most of the civil resistance movements have been failing, right? You see Myanmar, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Belarus, etc. All of us have been failing. So one of the hypotheses that we're working on is that there's a qualitative change in the type of autocracy. And my question is that if you have seen some of these in the latest examples of autocracies, the difference will be, for example, when you see Argentina, Pinochet, and all the ones, Hitler, it was like a very hierarchical thing, right? And then probably if you take out those people, well, the system will collapse, right? Or then you have the defection of the second one or the third one, and a thing like a transition may occur. And what we are trying to figure it out is if we are moving now for a transition movement that is more like a complex adaptive system in which you have like this chronic capitalism, but also like nodes and network, and it's more like a terrorism cell and cartels, in which it's not necessarily one leader. And I think that happened in Venezuela. Chavez died, but the system remained. I think that in Russia, Putin dies, and probably the system remains, and probably also with the amount of power that Erdogan had control in, and his party in Turkey, something like that could happen. So my question would be, have you perceived any qualitative change in the way these autocracies have been organizing compared to the previous, the other ones?
Yeah, great. Maybe I'll break that up into two questions. Like, what's the difference between authoritarianism then and now? And then conversely, what about civil society then and now in the Venezuela case and Turkey? Like, does civil society, like in the 90s, that used to be like the ticket, right? That was what was going to help us out, but maybe not now. Yes, Scott or Lisa or anybody? Yeah,
Sure. I mean, let me take a stab at the question about changes in the type of autocracy. So what I can say with certainty about that is that there's been a change in the dominant route to autocracy. If we compare 1945 to 90 with the period since the end of the Cold War, right? Since the end of the Cold War, by a clear majority, right? By a clear majority, the most common route to democratic breakdown is what I call executive takeover, right? By which a president or prime minister who is initially freely and fairly elected degrades democracy to such a degree that it becomes clearly an authoritarian regime. That kind of democratic breakdown existed before 1990, but it was the minority. Might have been, I don't know, 1 to 2, and now it's 2 to 1. So the ratio has changed very dramatically. I don't know if that's changed the type of autocracy, but it's possible that it has, right? It's possible that when you have to initially win freely and fairly, that you then build an autocracy more gradually and more attentively toward how do I keep winning votes? So, there are more autocracies that have the kind of elections that Lisel talked about, that is, they're clearly neither free nor fair, but they're still,
But you get more votes.
But you get more votes, right?
Yeah.
So, and what we know also is that autocracies based in authoritarian parties last longer. So I think there's some indication that the answer to your question is yes. If I could just, take a little detour also, I think today, if we think about in my lifetime, 3 big chunks of history in terms of the international system, there was the Cold War, and then there was a pretty brief period of clear US, Western European hegemony. There's no clear endpoint to that, but around 2005 or 2010. And then the last 18, let's say maybe as many as 18 years, right? What do we see? We see some erosion of US hegemony, a clear rise of China, and a clear aggressiveness, a clear reassertion of Russian authoritarian power. This affects the way countries around the globe can interact, right? I mean, in 1999, when Hugo Chavez took office in Venezuela, there were no powerful authoritarian players around the world. He started to help construct other authoritarian powers in Latin America. But today, I mean, you don't need to deal with the United States, right? If you want to stick your middle finger out at the United States, you can do it with much more ease than you could have in 1992 when Fujimori led the coup in Peru, but then had to bow to US and OAS pressure. No, you can't do this. So did he immediately democratize? No, but he immediately held a new constitutional assembly and unfree and unfair elections in 1995, but they were consequential. Right? So these changes in the international system, they've given much more space for autocracies since around 2005 than you had between roughly 1990 and roughly 2005.
Lisa, do you have any thoughts about whether the Turkish authoritarian autocracy is a different character, and then what about Turkish civil society?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the opportunity to address both of those. I think in terms of the nature of autocracy now under Erdogan, it's certainly the second type that Scott was talking about in terms of coming to power with a legitimate mandate under elections that were relatively free and fair, promising things that, didn't pan out, using the EU process as a way to clear out these obstacles. And then little by little, and kind of behind the scenes, I think it's not until about the Gezi Park protests in 2013 that the international community starts paying attention to, oh, wait a second, this government is cracking down on peaceful protesters. But arguably 6, 7, 8 years earlier, perhaps even earlier than that, there were already constitutional changes in the way that institutions were being stacked that were going to favor the AKP in the end. So this was a long-term project that I think is important to recognize. Could it have gone, just to pick up on a question that was asked earlier to Scott, could it have gone another way? Yes, it could have, I think. It wasn't inevitable. And I think that the EU, in fact, as I was kind of indicating earlier, fueled a lot of the sort of anti-Western rhetoric that Erdogan was able to use to consolidate his populist nationalist base. So yeah, it's the case of an authoritarian who incrementally, quite quickly, I would say, but incrementally is able to secure his power using the tools at his disposal to do so. Civil society is actually surprisingly resilient in Turkey. And I say surprisingly, because of the current nature whereby you can be jailed for retweeting something, you can be jailed for insulting the president, you can be jailed for supposedly misinformation. So this is a tool that's used to penalize journalists, civil society actors, and so forth. There's a push right now to criminalize LGBTQ associations in line with so-called family values that undergirded the AKP's withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention. So there's definitely an attack, an assault on civil society, and yet it remains pretty resilient. And that's also given the fact that following the 1980 coup, you had like the attempt to basically obliterate the left and really, really take on unions, anyone who was seen as potentially revolutionary and so forth. And remember, that's within the Cold War context, and Turkey as a NATO ally and so forth. So I do think civil society is surprisingly resilient. What I think allowed the AKP to win in what was this, really highly contested election, one that the opposition thought it was going to win, and I think it's worth considering why that wasn't the case, is not so much the lack of resilience of civil society, because we did see them turn up in droves as election monitors, get out the vote, informing voters and so forth, but rather the sort of structural and personalistic issues with the opposition. You had a coalition of 6 parties that tried to come together. They couldn't agree until sort of the last minute on a candidate who's going to be the unity candidate. It turns out that a lot of people very soon afterwards decided he was not an ideal candidate. You had fractures within the opposition. You had the identity politics, whereby it was very difficult for, say, the Kurdish left and the Turkish left to come together because of these identity divisions that have been polarized through previous governments, but which the AKP, at least since 2015, has also been polarizing. So I think looking at the weakness of opposition parties, their inability to come together is also a really important permissive condition in allowing authoritarians or electoral authoritarians to pull off the victories that they do.
Great. David, did you want to jump in on this?
Just jump in quickly on that. I mean, I think you heard in both of the answers the word legitimacy. And I think that, often, so I've done this little experiment. If you walk out on the street and ask people what's democracy, the most likely thing they're going to say has to do with voting. So that's going to be the first response. And sometimes there's more, but not always. So what you see, I think, is the 21st, just echoing what you've already heard, but the 21st century autocrat has really played on the majoritarian instinct, and that is democracy. So illiberal democracy is democracy in their eyes, right? Whereas when you think logically for a minute, right, if you don't give the opposition the right to oppose, the right to contest, the right to dissent, it's not really democracy in any meaningful sense. And yet playing on the majoritarian idea, right, we can get rid of the liberal, we can get rid of the protection to oppose, the protection for dissent, right? We can get rid of that and keep the majoritarian. There's a remarkable, I think, legitimacy, at least maybe for a time, we'll see how long, there. And so I guess I wonder, the 21st century autocrat has maybe fine-tuned that legitimacy of democracy. They've taken the piece that they can use, they've dispensed with the piece that they don't want, and they maintain maybe a higher degree of legitimacy than they otherwise would.
Right, and so it's so easy to get people to focus on just the very top of the above the waterline, just the ballot box. Oh, fine, you need a ballot box result? I can give you that, no problem, right? But yeah, good. Over here, yeah, please.
Hi, I'm Simon. I'm a MCMPA student from Israel and France. First, just to comment on the last thing that was said. I really think that the key is the definition of democracy. What is democracy? Is it just the rule of the majority, or is it a system based on values that will protect the minorities even at the expense of the will of the majority? And that's what's being played in a lot of cases. And on that note, I would love to hear your thoughts on what's currently happening in Israel.
I have no thoughts on what's happening in Israel. Or on the majority tyranny. I do have thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, we would learn much more about the Israeli case from you than you would from, at least from me. So, but I mean, yes, you know, I'm an admirer of Fareed Zakaria's, but he coined this expression, illiberal democracy. I don't think there is such a thing, right? For the reasons David has suggested, without liberal freedoms, we don't have democracy. And, you know, I follow the news enough to know that Israel is moving, or at least, you know, there's if the Supreme Court allows these reforms to go forward, that, you know, some of the checks on the ruling party will be greatly diminished. So I think probably Israel would be moving in an illiberal direction. But that's, I mean, I'm much more comfortable talking about the theoretical point, the conceptual point, than the case that you know 62,000 times more about than I do. Yeah.
So this is the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation, and a faculty member, an Ash affiliate named Ariel Prokacha, who is in the computer science department, just published an interesting piece in the Washington Post on Monday with another person who's Israeli, suggesting a democratic innovation for maybe beginning to feel the way out of the constitutional crisis or judicial executive conflict, which is a sit-in assembly. Like, instead of having Bibi Netanyahu and his enemies like duke it out in the streets, what about 200 randomly selected Israelis and see what they think at the end of a month? And I think that that's an idea worth considering, and something that has happened in a lot of other contexts. Yeah. Who's got the microphone? I'm just tracking the mic. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Let us assume that this period that you described as the post-Cold War period, where democracy had hegemony in the world and people's main attention, let us assume that democracy did not self as very inspiring with these wars in the Middle East. If that were true, and that we've become sort of weak in terms of providing a strategic vision to what democracy can achieve when it is given full vent, could you share with us your strategic vision for democracy? Give us the positive around which a world that is otherwise attracted by China, let's say, could rally around American democracy once again.
Or any democracy, need not be American. Yeah.
Or any democracy.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's a simple question.
I was about to fall over.
Look, I mean, democracy can be maddening. It can be ineffectual, it can be mediocre, and it can even be worse than that, right? I mean, it can fail. That's the story of my chapter in this book, right? But when we look as social scientists, or historians at the evidence. What does the evidence tell us? And I don't think this is an effective answer to citizens on the street, but what I have my undergraduates read is the social science about, the comparative performance, the average performance of democracy versus dictatorship. Which kind of regime promotes better economic growth on average? Democracy. Which promotes better health outcomes? I mean, this is according to the latest evidence. And these issues have been debated over time, but democracies, I mean, there's no single outcome that I know of for which autocracies perform better than democracies, except agrarian reform. And that's a curious except, because radical agrarian reform is very, very frequently extremely destructive. So if you want radical agrarian reform, you're better with autocracy than democracy, but with that huge caveat. I mean, I think, beyond these, the statistical work on these questions, what I also do with my undergraduates is show them 4 great movies about life under dictatorship. And it really makes the point, right? These are movies that you can't see under dictatorships, but they really make the point very effectively about how profound it is, right? Those of you who've lived under authoritarian regimes, right? I mean, it's not a good thing, right? And that can be very effectively portrayed through film or fiction or memoirs in a way. Oh, that's one of the 4. It's one of the 4 that I use. Absolutely. Yep. So that's an answer.
Good. And I'll add to the question, because I think this will have to be our final round. But that version of the question or another version is like 1 or 2 lessons out of your chapter or other chapters in the book for what people might do, movements might do, political leaders might do to either stem the erosion or build the resilience of democracy in any of the societies that we've been discussing. Yeah. Jump in and then Liesl gets.
I mean, look, one of the things, just going back to Scott's point, one of the things you see in the breakdowns is that there's always this going back to this question that you just raised. So I'll sort of tie the things together if I can. So there's almost always some weakness, usually economic weakness, some weakness of performance. So in the case of Athens, there's the invasion of Sicily, which goes terribly, right? And then that sort of leads, right? Or in Germany, the Depression sort of exacerbates all of this erosion that has occurred, and the legitimacy of the democracy had weakened, and then you have it weaken further with the Depression. So there's almost always sort of a performance piece, and so we have to be mindful of performance. And I think I would amplify what Scott said. Over the long term, not necessarily in the short term, but over the long term, I actually think these regressions don't do justice to democracy's advantage. If you look across all countries, which is how the regressions are normally run, developed and developing, you get, I would say, I would agree with Scott, a slight advantage for democracy on growth. There are people, very credible people, who would say it's slightly the other way, but probably an advantage. However, once you look and you limit it to developed economies, and it's a very different situation. There is no developed economy, rich industrial country, with possibly the exception of Singapore, which is a city-state, that is not a liberal democracy. So that, once you start getting, so there's something about that level of development that seems, so there, if you try to make a comparison, you don't even have enough cases to make a comparison at that, right? So that's, you're in a different space. So I actually think if you want to say something about the business environment, it's a harder argument to make in a developing country context. There, I think you have to start looking at some of the things Scott's talking about, what it looks like to live under. But if you want to make the economic argument, it's very strong, I think, once you get at a higher level of development. So that's in the background. What that leaves, though, is in the short term when you have a breakdown in performance. So if you think how do you distinguish the United States in the Great Depression from Germany in the Great Depression? And I think what we saw was much greater democratic erosion in Germany. You had a weaker democracy to start, a younger democracy. But the culture of democracy overall was not nearly as strong. In some quarters, it was very strong. But overall, on average, it was not. I think that culture of democracy is, in a sense, the shock absorber. That it won't take you forever. So if performance in your country is terrible, there's going to be political trouble is going to brew. But I think the question you need to ask yourself is what distinguishes when economic performance is poor, a country that responds to it by changing parties through an election versus a country that responds to it by overthrowing the democratic government. I think the culture of democracy is crucial there. And I think that's what we need to be building. And so maybe just to build on Scott's point, I'm sorry if I'm going over for a minute, but if you look in the United States, it's hard, we don't have the polling data, say from the 1930s, to say what is the level of commitment to democracy. But if I can take one case that I think is relevant to some of the questions, when FDR came in, he had very large majorities. He had very large majorities in his popular vote, in the electoral vote, in Congress, both houses. It was a dominant performance. What he did not have was the Supreme Court. And as you know, he kept enacting policy after policy. Some may have been good, some may have been bad, but the court was just striking them down one after another. And finally, in 37, he's had enough. And he comes up with this idea, this kind of vague idea, which is not inconsistent with the Constitution, to double the number of justices. And he thought, we'll bring in some younger justices and it'll help out the older justices. And it's good, but he's, of course, going to appoint all of them. What's interesting, although he had dominant support, dominance of both houses of Congress, they absolutely had the capacity by party to do it. They could pass this. There was no block that I'm aware of in the Constitution. There was very little interest in this idea. And this goes back to the kind of restraints. And so I would say there, whether it's because those lawmakers had some special sense of restraint or because they felt their constituents would not really approve of this, that's a debate we could have. But somehow that restraint was exercised. And again, people can disagree. Should they have been restrained? Should they have not? It's a fair disagreement. My sense, though, is the fact that Congress really wasn't that interested, even though they were so upset with what the court was doing at the time, was an indication, maybe I don't want to say right versus wrong, but it was an indication of their strength, of their commitment and their culture of democracy, and this kind of restraint that Scott's talking about. That, my guess, is if there was something similar that we could look at in Germany before the Nazi seizure of power, you wouldn't have seen that. And so that, I think, is the shock. That's the thing that allows you to differentiate in the short term. If performance lags, can you maintain your democracy, switch parties maybe, in who's in power, but not overthrow, versus an actual democratic breakdown. So I guess that maybe that's how I would frame that.
That's great. Thank you very much. Lisa, last word if you want it.
Oh gosh, thank you. What a responsibility. In terms of what can we kind of recommend to shore up against democratic erosion? I'll continue to go, this is a lot of water metaphors, to go below the waterline again. And to say to avoid at all costs complacence and hubris, because I think if the last 7-8 years in the US have shown us anything, it's that the assumption that this can't happen here, what we're seeing is not actually what we think it might be, because we're not Turkey and we're not these other countries. I think is a really important check on what can happen here. And then, going even deeper and looking at endemic structural racism and other issues to show us that, in fact, we didn't have liberty and justice for all in the first place, I think is really important. And that can be, even something as simple as making sure that you don't abandon the ballot boxes and making sure that you're exercising your right to be able to be the check on the processes that you can. And then I guess the other side, and this is, I'm really glad that Scott mentioned sort of the tool of film as a pedagogical tool in terms of conveying vernacular everyday perspectives of what it might be like to experience something that those of us who haven't lived under dictatorship won't know. But the role, and this is something I work on a lot, so it's near and dear to my heart, but the role of popular culture in sustaining momentum under authoritarianism and sustaining solidarity shouldn't be overlooked. And this is everything from, dissident literature in the Soviet Union that's being passed from place to place to, a pop song that maybe is it about the pandemic's going to pass, or maybe is it that the dictator is going to leave soon, right? So I think the use of, which is a Turkish pop song by Tarkan, one of the most popular pop artists there is. And so I think, taking political scientists to take seriously the role of popular culture in sharing information and sustaining momentum and solidarity is quite important. Hank Johnston also does incredible work on this. If you get to T5, where you have the revolution, let's go back to T1 and look at the jokes that people were making and the pop songs where they were insinuating messages and sharing information and revealing preferences and all those kind of things that can build up to the point where the opposition feels comfortable going out in the streets because they know they're not alone. So I would just say kind of both for political scientists and then for those in the opposition to think about the role that popular culture can play in sustaining that under even very heavy forms of authoritarianism.
That's wonderful.
Can I make a final comment?
Yeah,
really,
you
real
get the
quick?
last word.
No, just real quick.
David.
I want to say we can, I think just echoing, you can strengthen the culture of democracy. So there are examples of that. We don't have time to talk about it now, but that's something that can be done. There are strategies for doing it. We should be thinking hard about that. But I guess also I just want to say, I hope it's clear what a pleasure it's been for me to get to work with this incredible team, and John Cisternino, who's sitting over here, and all the authors who are not here. We had 3 co-editors and more than a dozen authors, and it was just an incredible honor, and I think you see why. So Arkan, being one of the co-editors, thank you for making this possible.
Well, thank you. It was a great discussion, great book. Thank you, everyone. It's so full of insights.